Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Partial funding is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today on Market Journal. I'm Bryce Duskett. The month of May continues to roll on, and we've got lots of ground to cover on this week's show. That includes some details on how to collect and submit crop samples and send them into the UNL Plant and Pest Diagnostic Center. We'll also go one-on-one with the president and CEO of a 100-year-old cooperative that has grown to be now in more than 50 countries today. Doug Simon from Tredas will also join us a bit later in the program as we discuss the latest when it comes to the markets. That is a look at what we've got coming up on today's show, but we begin by heading out and into the field. We visit now with my colleague Clay Patton from the Rural Radio Network, who this past week took part in the Hard Winter Wheat Tour, hosted, of course, by the Wheat Quality Council. Clay, you're joining us today as you're just outside of Heuerman, Nebraska. Much of that tour, though, focused on the state of Kansas. They dipped down into Oklahoma a bit as well. Broadly speaking, what's the purpose of the tour, Clay?
So what the Wheat Quality Council has done now for decades has been able to merge those who are integral in the wheat industry on the backside and the processing side with the farming side of it. So back in the early days, early 1900s, oftentimes wheat farmers would invite bakers from Kansas City to tour the wheat crop. Today, this involves wheat millers, bakers, and others in the industry, including those who often trade in the markets, to come and see the crop firsthand, get out into the farm fields and see what's happening with the winter wheat crop. Focused mainly on Kansas, as that is where a large majority of the hard red winter wheat comes from. And this year we're having the opportunity, unfortunately it parallels 2022 and being what looks to be a rougher crop.
All right, Clay, well, let's talk about it then. What are you seeing out in those fields?
So just out the gate, we started in Manhattan, Kansas on the first day of the tour, and now we're in Heuerman, Nebraska. The first stop out of the gun right there near Clay Center, Kansas was a really solid field. 49 bushels per acre is where our formula estimated it at. It was a good thick stand, no disease pressure. The second one just a little further to the north and to the west, that's where we start to see a little bit of freeze damage. We estimated about 10% of the field being affected by that. Here in Thayer County, here on the south side of Heuerman, we're seeing one of the poorest fields we've seen so far on the trip, only about 18 bushels per acre, unfortunately. With that, had the opportunity to talk with the farmer that actually owns this ground. It is in behind some soybean ground, so it's a soybean wheat type rotation. Wheat typically does perform a little poorer in behind the soybeans, but given the fact that they're well under their average for precipitation in this area, it's struggling. We measured a 4-inch crack here in the soil. So again, subsoil moisture is tough in this part of the country.
Clay, you mentioned the abandoned acres. What do you think is going to happen to those abandoned acres? What are you hearing?
You know, that's a really interesting question. I had the opportunity to talk with Gary Miller-Shasky, who's president of the Kansas Wheat Commission currently. He's a farmer in southwest Kansas, and he notes just in his area upwards of 4,000 to 5,000 abandoned acres. And a lot of guys are trying to put in another crop if they've got some subsoil moisture. Maybe they're trying in with some milo. Other guys putting in some ryegrass just to try and create a forage crop. Others going to an old system of fallow ground where they're going to let that ground just sit here for the next year, see if it can't gather some moisture up, and then try to come back in with more of a cash crop next year.
All right, Clay, thank you very much for joining us and for sharing that insight. By the way, the tour made 318 stops on Tuesday. They calculated a yield of just shy of 30 bushels per acre. If realized, that'd be nearly 10 bushels lower than the yield that they measured last year. Final numbers will be posted online at the website ruralradionetwork.com. As we move on now, we've discussed it before here on Market Journal, but recently we had the chance to see it in action out in the field. UNL researchers expanded a project this year as they work to autonomously plant using a machine that they call FlexRow. Market Journal's Mike Straub has this story with some footage from the field. Mike?
For the past several years, a team at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln have been working on a new piece of technology that is geared towards making field maintenance much easier. Their solution is an innovation called FlexRow. This is an unmanned ground vehicle that can distribute seeds, chemicals, and fertilizers.
We have a multi-purpose robotic platform called FlexRow, and like I said, it's multi-purpose, so we could do planting, we could do phenotyping, and also spraying. So we are going towards climate smart agriculture, which is really important, and robotic tools and technology tools have a big role to play. So we see FlexRow as one of those important robotic tools that can do very precise operations in the field while saving costs. If you think about targeted spraying, so only spray where things are needed instead of spraying throughout the field. Fertilizer application is another one we're exploring, where can we do very targeted fertilizer application.
The FlexRow is intended for multi-purposes and is built to be modular.
And when we started, our goal was how can we develop a field usable robotic platform that is modular, but also it should have the ability to do multiple operations. So we have 6 computers on this machine that exchange information, or a network called CAN bus, so that we can do very precise operations. And also we're using different camera technologies to look at green pixel fraction, which is basically in an image how much greenness is there. We're using spectrometers that tells us nutrient deficiencies. So there's a lot of sensor technologies that we're using, and using all that information to make decisions so that we can very precisely do site-specific management.
While someday the FlexRow could be a part of everyday use for farmers and producers, developing farmer-friendly robotic solutions that are easy to use involves a lot of obstacles.
So we are at this is a research prototype, so taking this to an actual product that farmers can actually use is a big hurdle, So how do you make a product out of a prototype, right? So that's very important, So I'm exploring if some of my students, they want to do this as a startup company. That is one way to do it, take the intellectual property we developed and make it into a company. So that's one avenue. I think the important point is how can we develop farmer-friendly robotic solutions is what is important. How can we give a system to a farmer that is not too complex, and it is easy to use. So there's a lot of thought that needs to go into it. So it's not like research, right? So in research, we are aware of the system, how it works. If there's a problem, we know how to troubleshoot it. But when we're giving this system to a farmer, it needs to be really well thought out. But I would say maybe in the next 3 to 4 years, this type of technology will be available.
FlexRow could be a product which, in the future, could aid researchers with a few acres of plots to farmers with thousands of acres. Before this can happen, however, there are some hurdles to overcome. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Mike Straub.
All right, thanks for that story, Mike. Pretty cool to see that FlexRow in action out there at the Rogers Memorial Farm. If you're not sure where it's located, it's just east of the capital city of Lincoln. Moving on now, she is the President and Chief Executive Officer of one of America's premier agribusiness and food companies. Beth Ford was a guest last week at a Heuerman Lecture titled Uncharted Waters, Why Everyone Should Care About the Global Water Crisis. We had the chance to visit with her one-on-one about her lecture and some of the challenges she sees on the horizon for the ag industry. Joining us now is the President and CEO of Land O'Lakes. That is Beth Ford. We welcome you to the university. Welcome you back to Nebraska.
Thank you.
Well, you gave your lecture here about water. Broadly speaking, 30,000-foot perspective, what was the message you wanted to share?
What I'm trying to do, we have kind of a thought process in our business, and we are a farmer-owned cooperative, also a 100-year-old business, and a Fortune 200 company. So it kind of plays against all areas. What we try to do is say we focus on things with awareness, advocacy, action. Now here at the university, I think, and especially since we're in an ag state, folks are more aware of water, why it's so critically important to the food production. What I wanted to leave a message on was the critical nature of us informing others, of us being in multiple different types of rooms to make sure everybody understood the fragility of the food supply, why water is so critically important to food production. Water demand's set to outstrip supply by 56% globally by 2030. That's in the near end. And then I wanted to say, let's connect the dots. It's not just water, it's ag research funding. And here we are at the university where ag research is a primary area of interest and focus, and why that's so critical. Drought-tolerant seeds, applied research, and that will help us meet that grand challenge of feeding a growing world population set to grow to 9.5 to 10 billion by 2050.
We'll talk more about the funding of some ag research here in a moment. Back on the water challenges. Here in Nebraska, we see our backyard, our front yard, so to speak. A lot of dry areas across the state of Nebraska right now, but from where you see agriculture across the whole U.S. and truly across the world, what are some of the key challenges you think people should be aware of?
Well, water policy and water investment is local, but it has a global impact. And especially on, in the United States, food security is national security. I'd say that globally. There's an interconnected nature of food and the food supply chain, food value chain globally. So when you think about investment and when you think about this locally, and here, to your point, this has been, there have been areas that have been in drought. If you go to Kansas, they've been in drought. California, they've been in drought. They've certainly had a lot of water over the last number of months, but at the same time, the question ends up being, what has been the infrastructure investment on the water capture, the reservoirs? What about over the long term? Do we understand the potential drought conditions? And then how should we think of this? And oftentimes what comes up is some local discussion, not a wrong discussion. This isn't a local versus not, states' rights versus federal, that's not what I'm interested in. I am interested in saying we have to elevate the conversation for primary industries or primary protective areas, in this instance, the food supply, and say whatever decisions we make on investment in areas, especially where production agriculture occurs, it needs to be with somewhat of a lens of saying, what are we going to do to meet this challenge of feeding a growing world population?
So we talk about the investment, particularly on the federal end of things. We've got an upcoming farm bill coming up, obviously. One of the talking points I hear is about China's investment into food and ag compared to the U.S. I'm sure you have that stat fairly familiar. Share with us what that stat is and some of the challenges you see with it.
Yeah, ag research funding at the federal level here in the United States has fallen to 1970s level. That's, for me, a very scary thought. China's outspending us 5-1 on investment because their whole focus, and they've stated this, is to be food self-sufficient. Now, aren't we fortunate? We have some of the best land in the world, best farm practices, great yield, great farmers, etc. And we are food self-sufficient, but globally, what leads to geopolitical instability is an inability to feed your family. That's why we see a lot of these climate immigrants coming up from the south. Where was the food? Where were the grains going from Ukraine? They were going into North Africa, another unstable area geopolitically. So all of these things kind of fit together, and here we are in the great state of Nebraska, a production area that is so critically important, and I just want us to make sure that we have that conversation more broadly.
Now, if you missed that lecture, you can watch it online by visiting the link that we've attached with this story. You can find that on the Market Journal website. Well, it is now time to turn our attention over to the markets. This week, we were joined on Wednesday afternoon in the studio by Doug Simon from Tredas. Let's begin this conversation talking about wheat. Of course, we had our update from Clay when it comes to the wheat report and what they're seeing down there. USDA also came out with some of their projections on their latest report. I guess, what are you seeing in that market? What's the big picture?
Last Friday, that was the one big surprise from the report. They were down 100 million bushels below the trade expectations. So those numbers, when you look at hard red winter wheat, we're down to about as low as what we were in 2007 and 8, about 140 million bushel carryover. So it definitely tightened up the balance sheet. And wheat went to 13.80s back in 2007 and 8, and now we're more in the $9 range, 8.85 I think today on Wednesday. So we're not anywhere near those high prices that we were in 2007 and 8, but we were there last May, a year ago, when the Ukraine war broke out. So we've had a big washout in the wheat market, but everybody in Nebraska knows that our wheat's really in terrible shape. It's I know people that aren't even going to take out the combines, because the wheat is so poor. It hasn't improved with the rain that we've had lately, so it'll be interesting to see what they see on the Kansas wheat tour there. I think they were down 10% on the numbers out of Kansas yesterday. I haven't heard anything on Wednesday yet, but when you look at big picture though too on wheat carryover, the stocks are actually in the U.S. about 600 million bushels, and we were about 300 million bushels in 07-08. So we definitely have more wheat on hand here in the U.S. But when you look at like the world numbers, we actually have more wheat on hand as well. But we always look at it as economists like a stocks to what we use ratio, and those are both kind of similar to what they were in or about 19% back in 2007 and 8 when we had that big run in wheat. So there could be some more excitement in the wheat because as poor as a crop is, it's really tightened up even more. And that was different for USA to come out and be that aggressive cutting wheat, but also cutting abandonment. In Kansas is supposed to be about almost 20% of the wheat's going to be abandoned. Yeah. Maybe about 15% in Nebraska, but it's a bigger deal in Kansas because they're number 1 producer of wheat. We're number 15. So, yeah.
Well, let's travel outside the U.S. borders. You're talking about kind of the world stage there. Mention something that's happened today. The Ukrainian grain corridor, we talked about that last week, is being extended another 2 months. Is that what you're hearing?
That's what the report came out today, kind of later this morning, that they were going to extend that for 2 months. And really it has to have some consideration from Russia. I think that's in their best interest because they want to continue to try to move wheat. It's not really granting any favors to the Ukrainians, but more their self-interest.
All right, let's talk corn and soybeans for a bit. As you and I have this conversation again on Wednesday afternoon, the charts are not looking pretty. Bit of a sell-off today. Why, or is there a why this time?
Well, I think it's a continuation. We had the reports last Friday, and the numbers that came out, the carryovers they had there, about 2.2 billion bushels on corn, about 335 million bushels on the soybean side. Those are numbers that we saw from commercials. The USDA Outlook Forum was at those numbers, back in February, maybe a touch higher than what those numbers were, but they were about 10% more each of those than what they were expecting from the traders' expectations. So they cut exports on the corn side of it, which was granted should have been done. But big picture, they also added some more production to Brazil. They didn't cut the production in Argentina on the corn and the beans as much as what some of the traders were thinking. So overall, the report came out as very bearish. It went down, corn went down to 572. It went down kind of close to that low that we put in. Now today, we kind of just blew through that because of initially there was another cancellation of export sale to China of about 10 million bushels. And then later in the morning, they announced the Ukraine deal. But a lot of it's just fund selling. The funds are now short about 110,000 contracts of corn and about 120,000 contracts of wheat. It's just when they start getting into a trend, they just push it and they exaggerate it and push it even further.
One of the things you like to hit on when you come on to Market Journal, and I appreciate this, what are we going to do about it? What are the strategies we can do today because of what's happening in the market? So what are some of your thoughts there, I'm sure, particularly when it comes to basis?
Yeah, well, basis is it's firmed up here in the last couple of weeks with the futures, falling off. We're $1 over at Albion markets. Columbus is 95. We're 95 up in northwest Iowa. So if you need to move corn, the basis levels are good. You can always do something, re-own it on the board. Call. Volatility is pretty cheap right now. You can rebuy, re-own that corn if you need to. But again, like looking at new crop corn, seasonality-wise, we're still probably in a downward seasonal more aggressively on corn than we are on beans. The bean seasonality really kind of gives you opportunities here, April, May, June, kind of July. But I think we still need to look at, continuing to make sales. We've been talking about that all the way since last January about making incremental sales in here, but you still need to kind of keep hitting some increments. A good way to do it if you don't really feel good about selling in here is still to use some options. Today's a better day than any if you're going to do something, buy puts, or if you're going to sell it, probably go out and hedge it. You can buy some calls to go with it, keep some flexibility in the market, especially as hard as they've hit it in the last month here on corn and on beans.
Thanks to Doug for taking the time of his week to join us. Coming up next week, we'll be headed out to Briggs Feed Yard. Catch up with our friend Mike Briggs to discuss the latest when it comes to the cattle markets. If you have a question you'd like me to ask Mike, be sure to email us and I'll be sure to pass your question along. Well, let's talk weather now with Market Journal weather analyst Bill Boyer. Bill, sounds like more warm weather is headed our way, right?
Well, yes, the short answer is we are going to see some warm to hot temperatures throughout the week here. I guess seasonal to above normal temperatures would be a great way to describe it. But we've also had some good moisture here over the last week to 10 days, and we've got some improvement. Latest drought monitor released on Thursday. We still have extreme drought conditions here in portions of central and eastern Nebraska. We'll call it east central through northeast Nebraska. And the worst of the drought conditions and exceptional drought conditions there in a 7 or 8 county region encompassed in there. The good news is we've had improvement on the other end of the state, here from portions of the Sand Hills down through southwest Nebraska, then back up through the Panhandle. Those areas were in the extreme drought condition. They've been dropped a category to severe. Still in the drought conditions, but severe, a category better than extreme And I think we'll see some improvement in that as we've seen even more moisture the last couple of days. Take a look at why we've seen the improvements in part of the state and not the other. This is year-to-date precip. We're running here in northern Nebraska a half an inch or so above normal, but from Broken Bow down through North Platte, 2.5 inches. Imperial over 4 inches above normal for the year, almost 2 inches in McCook, a little over an inch above normal in Sidney. Scotts Bluff and Chadron both 2.25 to 2.5 inches above normal. But look at the other side of the state. The Tri-Cities almost 3 inches below, 2 3/4 below. In Norfolk, almost 2 inches below in Omaha, and 4 inches below normal year to date in Lincoln. That's why those areas continue to see the drought holding on or even intensifying in some areas, while the rest of the state is seeing improving conditions. But we've got some improvement for those areas, I think, late on in this week. Not this weekend. It is gorgeous. Get out and enjoy it. It's going to be very quiet, just maybe an isolated thunderstorm tomorrow night. Otherwise, we go through the weekend dry, and we start next week with some isolated late-day showers and thunderstorms, mainly in western Nebraska Monday and Tuesday. And then again on Wednesday, we're going to see some hit-or-miss showers and storms in the late afternoon and evening hours in the central and west. Now by Thursday, those spread more across the state. And notice what happens as we go into Friday afternoon and evening. The model's throwing out some heavy rain here in central and eastern Nebraska. We'll have to pay close attention to that. Temperatures are going to be in the 80s through the weekend, and then even some 90s sneaking in here as we get into next week. As you can see, above normal temperatures seem to be coming our way for the rest of this week. And that doesn't change as we take a look at precip, most heavy on the eastern half of the state. 8 to 14 day outlook has temperatures above normal and precip near normal. So hopefully we're able to get some mild temperatures and some rain for everyone.
All right, thank you very much for that update, Bill. We'll keep our fingers crossed when it comes to getting some moisture. Well, recently here on Crop Talk, we discussed some of the seedling diseases you want to keep an eye out for when it comes to your corn crop. If you plan to submit any samples into UNL's Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic, there are a few basic steps you'll want to follow to get the best results possible. We talked with UNL's Kyle Broderick to learn a little bit more about that process, but he began by sharing an overview of the clinic.
Yeah, so really we are here to provide diagnostic support to farmers in Nebraska and surrounding areas. And so within the diagnostic clinic, we receive samples not from all 50 states, but in my 7 years, I think we've hit about 40 different states that we've received samples for. So not just Nebraska growers, but really can be nationwide. And I primarily focus on the diseases, so fungi, bacteria, viruses, things like that. And this time of year, everybody's gunning to get into the field. If they want to see stuff coming up out of the ground, just fine. But unfortunately, as stuff's coming up, maybe it's not coming up as even as one would hope. And that's really where the diagnostic clinic can come in to provide a few answers. And because one of the biggest issues with seedling diseases is they can all look the same. And it's rare that we can tell a whole lot about what the different disease is in the field. Is it Rhizoctonia? Is it Fusarium? Honestly, in the field, they look almost identical.
Kyle, you set up the why behind this pretty well as you talk about that. I think it is sometimes tempting, though, as you look out in the field, there's some uneven spots to say, it'll eventually come back. I don't need to sample this year. I guess debunk that. Tell us a little bit more of the why.
It's the reality is, most of it's probably not, it may come up a little bit, but right now is the most important time to get a good start on plant growth. If some of these plants start off behind, maybe it's just a smaller pocket, they start off a little bit stunted, they're not growing quite as well as the rest of the field, those plants are never going to catch up. And so that area is always going to be a little bit of a yield drag for you. And unfortunately, as we're moving throughout the field, we are now spreading these diseases around. Anything that moves the soil is going to move some of these diseases. And so as we're cultivating, as we're applying any pesticides, we're spreading those around. And if we have the right environmental conditions, what was once a small patch can become a pretty large segment of the field. And once, replanting is always an option, but you really don't want to replant and have the exact same thing happen again.
Well, hopefully we've convinced the viewers today to go through this process and send some samples in. So let's walk through the steps if they choose to do so. First one is to collect. What's that look like?
Yeah, so really when collecting some samples, one thing that we ask is that we get both some very diseased but also some healthy samples as well. We also ask that you send as much material as you're happy to part with. One of the things that's always kind of a pet peeve of mine is when I'll get a sample from a 160 acre soybean field and I will get 2 plants. You know, and there's a lot more than 2 plants in that 160 acre field. The grower's not gonna miss those at all. And so the more samples that we receive, the better. Ideally, at least 4 to 6 disease samples. That way, you know, we have some other plants we can go back to, pull a fresh sample if we need to, try to isolate from a different area without having to call you, ask you to go out and collect some more soil. And as we're actually collecting those plant samples, we're after about 4 to 6 disease plant samples. We're going to dig up that entire plant and including the root ball and try to collect as much of the roots as you can. We do ask that you maybe try to shake some of that dirt off, but it's really not going to be the end of the world. Then if you could please put that into a sealable plastic bag, something like a Ziploc bag works really well, with a couple of dry paper towels. We never want to add moisture to our samples, because if we're adding excess moisture, now we're basically creating an ideal environment for any fungus, any bacteria to thrive. And by the time I can look at the sample, maybe it's 2-3 days after you've collected it. Maybe something else has started growing in there if you've added some damp paper towels instead of those dry paper towels.
If you're interested in learning more about some of those steps in submitting your samples into the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic at UNL, we've included a helpful link along with this interview. You can find that on the Market Journal website. Well, that is going to do it for this week's edition of Market Journal. If you did miss a story, be sure you're following the Market Journal team on social media and on YouTube to join in on the conversation. We do hope to see you back here next time. Until then, I'm Bryce Duskett, wishing you a safe and productive week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Partial funding is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.